The world was watching. Tensions were at an all-time high. Global leaders had gathered for what was supposed to be a standard trade summit, until Donald Trump walked in. Markets were in chaos. Allies were uneasy. China, Canada, and Mexico had already threatened retaliation after Trump's latest trade tariffs. This summit was supposed to be the moment where diplomatic lines would be drawn, negotiations would begin, or everything would spiral into a full-scale economic war. But what happened next? No one saw it coming. As Trump took the stage, the entire room fell silent. Some expected him to double down on his aggressive stance. Others thought he might offer a last-minute compromise. But instead, Trump reached into his jacket, pulled out a single document, and what he said next sent shockwaves across the world. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is a moment that changed the course of global trade forever. The Geneva Convention Center was packed with some of the most powerful figures in the world. Delegates from the United States, China, Canada, the European Union, Mexico, and Japan sat at long conference tables, their faces tense, their conversations hushed. The air was thick with unease and the room buzzed with nervous energy. The stakes couldn't be higher. Just days before, Donald Trump had announced sweeping new tariffs, shaking the foundations of global trade. He had slapped heavy import taxes on China, Mexico, and Canada, igniting immediate backlash. China threatened economic retaliation, warning that they would cut off key exports to the U.S. if the tariffs were not lifted. Canada and Mexico demanded exemptions, arguing that their economies would take a major hit. The European Union, caught in the middle, hinted at its own countermeasures, signaling that an all-out trade war might be inevitable. For weeks, speculation ran wild. News anchors debated whether this was Trump's master plan to force better deals or a reckless gamble that could cripple the global economy. Analysts warned that supply chains could collapse. Politicians on all sides issued urgent warnings, cautioning that the world had never been closer to a full-scale economic showdown. But inside that grand conference hall, one question remained unanswered. What was Trump's next move? The media pit was overflowing with reporters, cameras rolling, capturing every second of the summit. Microphones were pointed at whispered conversations. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed that Trump had already made a backdoor deal with China, while others insisted that he was about to walk out and abandon the talks entirely. Then, just as the whispers reached their peak, the doors at the back of the hall swung open. Donald Trump had arrived. Instantly, the room fell silent. He walked in slowly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hesitating. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every world leader in that room studied him carefully. Some braced themselves for a confrontation. Others whispered to their advisors, trying to predict his first move. Even his own delegation appeared tense, as if unsure what their leader was about to do. Would Trump double down on his tariffs, forcing a confrontation that could plunge the world into an economic crisis? Would he strike an unexpected deal, leaving even his closest critics speechless? Or would he do something so bold, so unpredictable, that it would leave every leader in that room in absolute shock? No one was prepared for what happened next. The moment Donald Trump stepped into the summit hall, the energy in the room shifted. Delegates who had been whispering suddenly went quiet. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, watching intently. Others exchanged nervous glances, waiting for the first sign of what was to come. At the far end of the table, China's trade minister adjusted his tie, whispering something to his aide. Across from him, the Canadian Prime Minister tapped his pen against the table, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, an EU delegate scrolled through his phone, likely checking the latest market reactions, preparing for whatever came next. Trump didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he walked toward the main podium, his steps slow, deliberate. From the media pit, reporters frantically typed, cameras flashing. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Was Trump about to declare economic war? Or was he here to make history with an unprecedented trade agreement? Just days before, his tariff announcements had sent shockwaves through global markets. The Dow Jones plummeted. The Shanghai Stock Exchange dipped as China threatened countermeasures. Mexico and Canada were already in talks with their trade allies, preparing to retaliate. The European Union had hinted at a collective response, warning that Trump's policies could collapse international supply chains. The world was on edge. At the summit, tensions were at a boiling point. A few feet away from Trump, China's delegation sat stiffly, their expressions carefully controlled. Some of them had already begun drafting new sanctions against the U.S., preparing to strike back if Trump refused to budge. The Mexican representative, gripping a folder of trade documents, was visibly tense. His country's economy depended on exports to the U.S., and Trump's tariffs could be devastating. Would Mexico be forced to negotiate under pressure, or would they stand their ground? At the center of it all, Trump stood motionless at the podium, scanning the room. Then, finally, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a single document. The room held its breath. Some assumed it was a prepared speech, others feared it was a formal notice of further sanctions. But when Trump finally spoke, his voice calm but commanding, he said just one sentence, one that no one in the room was prepared for. And what he said next? It changed everything. As Donald Trump stood at the podium, the room was frozen in anticipation. Every world leader, every trade official, every advisor in the room was locked onto him, waiting for his next move. For a moment, he didn't say a word. He let the tension build. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of every major player, the Chinese delegation, the European Union representatives, the Canadian Prime Minister, the Mexican trade officials. Each of them had prepared for this moment, but none of them knew what was coming. Then, with his signature slow, deliberate motion, Trump lifted the document in his hand and placed it on the podium. The silence was deafening. The media pit, packed with journalists, was on edge. Some reporters had their fingers hovering over their keyboards, ready to type the first words of his announcement. Camera shutters clicked, capturing every second of the suspense. The Chinese trade minister whispered something to his aide. The EU delegate leaned forward, squinting at the document in Trump's hand, trying to decipher what it could mean. Even Trump's own delegation seated behind him looked uncertain. Then Trump finally spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and measured, "what I hold in my hand is something that will change the global economy forever." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some leaned toward their advisors, whispering hurriedly. Others remained silent, waiting for more. Trump paused for effect, then continued. "For weeks the media has speculated. You've all made your assumptions. Some said I was going to walk away. Others said I'd double down on the tariffs, but let me make one thing clear." He placed both hands firmly on the podium. "I didn't come here to back down. I came here to set the terms." The room tensed. Was this a declaration of economic war? The Canadian Prime Minister stiffened in his seat. The Chinese delegation exchanged uneasy glances. European leaders braced for impact. Trump took a step back, unfolding the document. Then, with the world watching, he read the first line aloud, and in that moment, everything changed. The room remained eerily silent as Donald Trump unfolded the document in his hands. Every world leader, every diplomat, and every reporter held their breath, waiting for the words that would define the future of global trade. Then, in his unmistakable voice, Trump read the first line aloud. "Effective immediately, the United States will—" He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. The Chinese delegation leaned forward, their hands clenched into fists. The Canadian Prime Minister's jaw tensed. The European Union's lead negotiator furrowed his brows, eyes darting to his advisors. Would Trump escalate the tariff war, throwing the global economy into chaos? Would he reverse course, shocking his own supporters? Or was he about to do something so unpredictable, so unprecedented that no one saw it coming? Then Trump continued, "Offer a deal unlike anything in history." A wave of murmurs rushed through the hall. This wasn't an ultimatum, this wasn't an attack, this was something entirely different. Trump lifted his eyes from the document, looking directly at the Chinese delegation. "We are prepared to eliminate all tariffs, under one condition." The murmurs exploded into full-blown whispers. The media pit was in chaos. Reporters scrambled to type, their headlines shifting in real time. Some had expected a declaration of economic war, not this. Across the table, the Chinese trade minister whispered urgently to his advisors. They had come prepared for retaliation. They had not come prepared for negotiation. The Canadian Prime Minister tapped his pen anxiously against the table. Was this a real offer, or was it just another high-stakes gamble? Trump let the confusion settle before continuing. "If every nation at this table agrees to these terms, we are willing to rewrite global trade rules from the ground up. No more unfair practices. No more one-sided deals. This is a reset." Some delegates looked stunned. Others looked suspicious. This wasn't just a trade agreement. This was an ultimatum disguised as an opportunity. But what exactly was Trump asking for? What were the terms of this so-called reset? And most importantly, would anyone dare to take the deal? The answer would change the course of global trade forever. For a moment there was silence, a deep, uneasy silence that filled the massive hall as every leader, every official, every journalist tried to process what Donald Trump had just said. And then, chaos. The summit room erupted into a frenzy. Voices overlapped in a chorus of confusion, disbelief, and tension. Delegates turned to their aides, whispering frantically. Some slammed their hands on the table in frustration. Others simply stared at Trump, their expressions shifting between shock, anger, and pure uncertainty. The Chinese delegation stiffened, exchanging sharp glances before whispering furiously among themselves. The European Union representatives huddled together, their quiet murmurs escalating into heated discussions. The Mexican trade minister adjusted his tie nervously, clearly trying to assess the situation. The Canadian Prime Minister tapped his fingers rhythmically against the table, his gaze fixed on Trump, waiting for an explanation that made sense. From the media pit, reporters scrambled to update their stories. Fingers flew over keyboards. Microphones buzzed with hushed but urgent analysis. Some journalists dictated their breaking news live on air, their voices barely containing the tension in the room. Camera shutters clicked non-stop, capturing every facial expression, every movement, every detail. News anchors whispered breathlessly to their producers. Did Trump just rewrite the global trade system? Is this a negotiation tactic or the beginning of a full-scale trade war? The markets were already reacting in real time. Wall Street fluctuated wildly, with stock prices spiking and dipping in unpredictable waves. In Beijing, London, and Tokyo, financial networks broadcast emergency discussions. Analysts debating the fallout, investors scrambling for answers. The Canadian Prime Minister finally leaned forward, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat and spoke first. "Mr. President, with all due respect, are you saying the United States will drop all tariffs just like that?" Trump nodded, his expression unwavering. "That's exactly what I'm saying, but only if every nation in this room agrees to my terms." The Canadian official leaned back in his chair, stunned. The Mexican delegation flipped through their notes, whispering among themselves. The entire summit had expected Trump to escalate the situation, perhaps even threaten new penalties, but no one had expected him to offer a deal. After a long pause, the Chinese trade minister finally spoke. His voice was measured, but his expression betrayed skepticism. "And what exactly are these terms, Mr. President?" A small smirk formed on Trump's face, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He took his time, adjusting the document on the podium before answering. "Fair trade. No more currency manipulation. No more stolen technology. No more one-sided trade deals that punish American workers." The room exploded again. Some leaders scoffed, others shook their heads. A few whispered hurriedly to their advisors, trying to process what this meant for their economies. The Chinese delegation fell into a hushed but intense conversation, some nodding and understanding, others furrowing their brows. The European leaders exchanged uneasy glances, some appearing interested, others already preparing counter-arguments. The Mexican trade minister tapped his pen against the table, visibly weighing the consequences. This was not what they had expected. The world had been prepared for a tariff war, expecting Trump to double down. Instead, he had presented a global trade ultimatum. Trump leaned forward, gripping both sides of the podium, his voice steady. "You want access to the U.S. market? Play fair. No exceptions, no loopholes, no games. Take it or leave it." A stunned hush settled over the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The ripple effect of those words could already be felt outside the summit walls. Markets were reacting in real time. Wall Street fluctuated wildly. The Dow Jones surged and dipped, investors trying to make sense of what had just happened. Social media erupted with speculation. Had Trump just outmaneuvered the entire global economy, or was this the beginning of an economic standoff unlike anything in history? Across the world, financial experts scrambled to understand the impact. Some hailed it as a masterstroke. Others called it reckless brinkmanship. But no one could deny that Trump had just made a move no one expected. And Trump? He said nothing more. He simply stood there, arms crossed, watching the fallout unfold. Would the world call his bluff? Or had he just reshaped global trade forever? The ripple effect was immediate. Inside the summit hall, world leaders scrambled to react. Some whispered urgently to their aides, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Others sat in stunned silence, knowing that whatever they decided next could alter the global economy forever. The tension in the room was thick. Some delegates appeared deep in thought. Others exchanged hurried conversations, their voices low but filled with urgency. A few officials quickly pulled out their phones, checking for instant market reactions, their expressions shifting between shock and concern. Advisors rushed in and out of side rooms, gathering data and relaying instructions to their respective governments. It was clear Trump's move had caught them off guard, and now they were playing catch-up. Outside, the media frenzy exploded. Cameras flashed nonstop as reporters hurried to relay updates. News anchors, caught off guard by the shocking announcement, scrambled to adjust their narratives. In broadcast studios across the world, financial analysts debated in real time. Was this a historic power move or a reckless gamble? Large screens inside newsrooms displayed live stock market tickers, where numbers swung wildly in response to the announcement. Wall Street saw an immediate surge, while markets in Beijing, London, and Tokyo fluctuated chaotically. Investors scrambled to predict the fallout, unsure whether this was the beginning of a new financial era or the prelude to an economic standoff. Headlines flashed across major news outlets. Trump rewrites global trade rules, ultimatum issued to world leaders. Shocking twist at trade summit. U.S. offers historic deal. Economic war or master negotiation. Trump's announcement leaves nations divided. The price of gold and oil skyrocketed as investors sought safe havens in the face of uncertainty. International currencies fluctuated wildly. China's yuan dipped, while the U.S. dollar spiked. The global financial landscape was shifting in real time, and the world was watching every second of it. China's response came swiftly. Just hours after Trump's announcement, an emergency press conference was held in Beijing. The Chinese trade minister, usually composed and measured, appeared visibly tense. "We will evaluate this proposal carefully," he stated, his tone controlled but his eyes betraying deeper concern. Behind closed doors, it was rumored that Chinese economic advisors had already begun drafting countermeasures, possibly preparing their own trade restrictions in response to Trump's bold move. Meanwhile, in Canada, political analysts speculated on how the Prime Minister would respond. Some believed he would push back, refusing to give in to U.S. demands, insisting that Canada would not be bullied into submission. Others argued that Canada had no choice but to negotiate, as its economy relied heavily on trade with the United States. In private meetings, Canadian officials were already debating potential next steps. Should they align with Europe and China against Trump's ultimatum, or should they try to strike their own deal with the U.S.? The same debate echoed in Mexico, where business leaders urged the government to consider the deal carefully. Some industries feared that rejecting the deal could lead to a collapse in exports, while others warned that accepting Trump's terms might mean conceding too much power over Mexico's economy. The stakes had never been higher. Inside the White House, Trump's closest advisors were already split. Some saw the move as a stroke of brilliance, a way to force every major economy to operate under the same rules. Others feared the consequences if the world rejected his terms, leading to diplomatic fallout and a potential global economic rift. Behind closed doors, administration officials debated how to handle potential retaliation. Would China impose sanctions? Would the EU respond with trade restrictions of its own? Meanwhile, social media erupted. Within minutes, the hashtag #TrumpTradeGamble was trending worldwide. Supporters hailed the move as a bold display of leadership, a game-changing moment that would finally level the playing field for American businesses. "This is the deal America has been waiting for," one post read. "Trump just did in minutes what past presidents couldn't do in decades." But critics warned that this could alienate U.S. allies and provoke unforeseen economic consequences. "This is reckless. He just disrupted the entire global economy with a speech," one analyst tweeted. Others worried about how smaller nations would be affected, especially those with fragile economies reliant on global trade partnerships. And Trump? He simply walked out of the summit without another word. The cameras followed him as he exited the hall, his expression unreadable. Reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them, heading straight for the exit. He had said everything he needed to say. Now it was up to the world to decide. Had he just pulled off the most strategic trade negotiation in modern history? Or had he just set the stage for an economic standoff unlike anything seen before? The world held its breath. And the next move? It wasn't Trump's to make. The summit had ended, but the shockwaves of Trump's announcement were only beginning to spread. Across the world, economic strategists, financial analysts, and political leaders were left scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. For years, global trade agreements had been built on delicate negotiations, slow-moving deals, and carefully balanced diplomacy. But in a matter of minutes, Trump had thrown out the rulebook and rewritten the game. The world's most powerful economies were now faced with an impossible choice: comply with Trump's demands and accept a new era of trade, or reject them and risk being locked out of the U.S. economy altogether. Some saw it as a masterstroke. His supporters hailed the move as a long-overdue correction to decades of trade imbalances. They believed Trump had just outmaneuvered the world's biggest economies, forcing them into a deal on his terms rather than theirs. If successful, this could shift trillions of dollars in global trade, reshaping industries, securing American jobs, and positioning the U.S. as the ultimate economic superpower. But others saw a dangerous gamble. Critics warned that this kind of aggressive negotiation could destabilize markets, alienate long-standing allies, and provoke retaliation. If China, the EU, and other major economies decided to push back, the world could be facing a full-scale trade war with consequences that would reach far beyond politics. Some industries in the U.S. feared backlash, with potential job losses and supply chain disruptions. The stock market, though reacting positively in the short term, was still unpredictable. Was this a long-term win or just a temporary surge before the real fallout hit? Meanwhile, the reactions from global leaders were mixed. In Beijing, Chinese officials held emergency economic meetings, carefully crafting their next move. Would they comply, renegotiate, or retaliate? In Brussels, the European Union debated its stance. Some member states saw an opportunity for better trade deals, while others saw a direct attack on their economic model. In Canada and Mexico, the stakes were even higher. These two nations relied heavily on U.S. trade, but accepting Trump's terms could mean sacrificing control over their own economies. And then there was Trump himself. He left the summit without answering questions, without debating, without hesitation. He had said what he came to say. He had put his offer on the table, and now the world had to respond. The next move wasn't his to make. It belonged to the world's most powerful economies. Would they call his bluff? Would they bend to his demands? Or would this turn into a global trade standoff unlike anything seen before? What do you think? Did Trump just secure one of the greatest trade deals in modern history? Or did he just light the fuse on an economic time bomb? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story intriguing, shocking, or thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more exclusive insights into the world's biggest power moves. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, because as we've just seen, one decision, one moment can change everything.